So today's the cyber seminar number 4. I thought I had that written here. There we go. The topic, we're going to basically have an introduction to where we're headed and why we're headed there in terms of CZOData future systems. It's meant a little bit not to, the idea of this talk, and in some ways it's premature because we don't have everything developed yet, right? It's still in the future. But the idea of this talk is to at least give all of you an appreciation of the kinds of issues and questions we've been dealing with as we develop the cyber infrastructure. All right, whoever just connected, I'm going to mute. Oh, all right, you muted yourself, or it doesn't sound bad. So we want to have an idea of where we're headed and why, and so this is a little bit of a preview of that. It also gives us an idea for what we want feedback or input from you all as we work on finalizing some of the specifications, for example, the control vocabularies or the display files, etc. So I'm going to do the main presentation, although Jeff Horsburgh is the lead PI of ODM2, and we're going to talk quite a bit about ODM2, but I'm going to do the presentation because I'm going to kind of keep it at a high level, and Jeff can jump in with detailed comments or answer questions as you have them. So we're going to take a step back. Let's see here. I keep on clicking on the wrong thing. There we go. So, just glance again at the architecture that's proposed and under construction and partially built, in fact, in many cases, for CZOData, the second phase of development. So, essentially, there are all these components that are connected. And some of the components that are drawn in boxes here are data storage databases, repositories. All the arrows are information transfer between those repositories. And some of these boxes are services that allow one to rapidly search for the data resources. I mentioned earlier that this structure of cyber infrastructure is really developed around this triangle where data servers store most of the data. The metadata gets harvested into a catalog. The catalog then gets queried by a client, such as a web browser or Hydro Desktop or some other client that allows users to interact. The catalog tells the client where to go look for the data, and then the client can go to the data server to get the data. So this is essentially the foundation of the modern internet and the foundation of almost all scientific cyber infrastructure. At the core, all right, sorry, I should have thrown that in there. So there's some storage, there's metadata transfer, there's software, and at the core of that, what allows this to work is the information model that connects one system to the other. So just to give an idea of what an information model is, we talk over and over again about metadata, how important metadata is. And remember, there's multiple kinds of metadata. And one of them is the metadata that describe what properties, fields, columns you're looking for in a data set. And the other one is how those different columns and fields might relate to other data tables, right? So we're used to, I showed this example earlier, we're all raised on storing data in spreadsheets, but spreadsheets or flat files are not very efficient in storing information, such as this repeated information about latitude or the name of the station. And so it's much better to separate out tables into logical conceptual entities and then relate them to each other. And that relationship in a database happens via keys that will relate the information in this table to the information in another table. That both saves on storage, but it also really reduces errors because the data is only stored once, and you can't have inconsistencies in the data. So this is not just the foundation of databases, but it's the foundation of the whole information system, as I described earlier. If you take that simple example, kind of one next step, you see that you begin to create these constructs where you have multiple tables and they're related to each other in multiple ways. And it's really very elegant. It allows one to, for example, have a lookup table of units with information about what those units are, rather than having to type out the units and, of course, getting it typed wrong so that it can't be searched very easily. So it enables all sorts of capabilities in cyber infrastructure. So you take those relational tables, and which might represent kind of conceptual ideas of how information is grouped together, the what, where, and when, for example, and you form a data model. And a data model is often depicted in diagrams like this. These are called entity relationship diagrams. An entity is essentially a table. What is listed in the table, though, in these diagrams are not the rows of the table, but these are actually the column headings, right? So the table might have hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of rows, each with a different hydro ID in it, for example. This just shows what fields are required. And it also shows how those fields are related to ideas or concepts that are contained in other entities, or how the two entities or tables relate to each other. So, this is an example of kind of the early beginnings of the quasi-hydro information system. So this information model can get abstracted one extra level. The data model can get abstracted one additional level into an information model. And the information model really looks at things differently in terms of specific field name and the relationships between, let's say, one table and another table. It's a little bit more abstract. It's the way object-oriented programming is done. And so these information models are usually thought of as class object models. So, for example, if you've done any programming in an object-oriented language, C, Python, Java, anything like that, you can define a class, and in this case it might be feature, and the subclass of monitoring point, water body, watershed, kind of inherit shared features from the base class, but then there may be some very specific additional information that you get when the subclass of feature is water body, for example. So modern programming languages work this way, and these data models and information models have to work together so that the data storage, which is an information model, can be then accessed by software that is usually written with object models. All right, so that's a little bit of background for some of you that may be review, for others that may be very new, but I just want to give that as a background for what we're really talking about. So Jeff, who's on this talk, for his PhD, after looking at those Maidman papers, and I'm going to paraphrase this for you, Jeff, started working with others in the hydrological community to really figure out, well, what are the concepts between how data gets stored for hydrological and water quality data. And they developed this entity relationship diagram, or data model schema, that's called it the observations data model. And the current one is version 1.1.1. You can see the various entities. Some of them look familiar. You recognize the name. There was an appreciation. Jeff is not a computer scientist, he's a hydrologist. And there's an appreciation that the computer scientists are not really the best people to do this, because they tend to be a little too abstract in terms of their concepts and terminology, and and they don't understand the fundamental relationships that are really most important in how data is for a domain or discipline is either produced or analyzed or queried, etc. So this was the data model that was developed, and it became the core for Quasi's hydro information system that still stands today. This information model got propagated into XML schemas and cataloging services and other things to make Quasi HIS function. I just zoomed into the core of this data model, and I don't want to get too close to the details, but I'll just point out a couple of things, right? So there's this sites entity and the data values entity, and there's a relationship between the two. There are mandatory bits of information for a site and then optional bits of information for a site, indicated by the letters and whether it's bold or not. And the same thing goes for data values. The relationship between the two has what's known as cardinality, which means that you can have one and only one site for that will then produce 0, 1, or many data values. So that cardinality is really important, and it allows the queries to work and the software to work. It's a rule that describes that relationship, but it also constrains the relationship, which for a database manager, that's a good thing, but for someone who's creating data sets or trying to fit their data into an existing data model, it can also be a challenge. And for example, I just recently heard this week that the Shale Hills group were having challenges because they wanted to add more than one sensor code or qualifier code to a single data value, but this data model does not support that, for example. So different domains come up with different data models because they fundamentally think about the processes in their data sets differently. This is a general geochemical data model that kind of summarizes at a relatively high level the information systems that have been developed by the EarthChem group, which is, actually the Integrated Earth Data Applications group, which oversees EarthChem, PetDB, CZDB, and a number of other data systems that were designed originally for the marine geology community, but have now expanded quite a bit into the terrestrial area. And they have a fundamentally different construct here. Whoops. Their observed values, or data values, are not directly connected to sites or the features of interest. Actually, this is even more abstract in feature than a site. This is a concept that includes things like a rock outcrop or an ocean, a body of water, from which specimens are collected or samples are collected, and they go through a process that requires a bunch of information about methods and that can be captured often in publication information prior to actually producing a data value. I guess this is where the method information is connected. So there's a difference in what information to go from something like a site, which isn't really fully captured here, all the way to an observed value requires additional information that's not in the Quasi information model. This information model is fundamentally different. But as you can see, it's pretty abstract, right? So the Shale Hills CZO, and specifically Sue Brantley's group, tried to take some of the concepts from EarthChem and really apply them to what their specific use cases were. And here you can see that they said, okay, well, we have samples, just like they do at in the geochemistry world, in the marine geochemistry world, and these samples can be subsampled, which actually is also part of what is well supported in AIDA's infrastructure. But to understand the context of these specimens, a Latin long from some region of the earth, which is sufficient for an oceanographer, is not sufficient for a soil scientist. And so they realized that they had to have additional information about depth intervals, what pit or core or well did that come from, and then information about the sampling site. And then they get to this much more general information about the location that that sampling site is in. So you can see there was quite a bit of additional information, some of it very specific. A lot of this other information is rather similar at some level. So the difference is that by adding this additional specific information, it can potentially complicate the transfer of information, because there may not be a place, if this information gets sent to EarthChem, to store the specific information about soil depth intervals. That may not be possible. It may be, but it may not be. It may be, maybe it's possible to store generic information about the depth interval, but maybe not information about the Surgo ID, because there are no Surgo IDs in the middle of the ocean. So, because they share a related, although they're a related information model, because there are differences, when you transfer from one to the other, there's loss of information. That's just inherent in the system. So, so what do you do when, actually, this is a little bit out of order for me. Sorry about that. I am going to move this over here. So what do you do when you're asked to oversee and integrate data from the critical zone discipline? Right? Imagine how what we just saw would propagate out to all the disciplines we're looking at. And these are very broad disciplinary levels, right? There may be actually sub-disciplines within these groups that would all, if we asked them to, specify and diagram out the way their data is produced and how it's related, they would all come up with different data or information models that would create massive challenges to interoperability. The data is really quite different. I've shown this slide before. You can separate out the CZOData into big data versus small, long-tailed, dark data. My animations are all messed up. You can categorize the data into oh yeah, all right. You can categorize the data into these various disciplines that produce time series that might come from automated sensors in situ in the environment, or disciplines where they primarily collect specimens or samples and bring them into the laboratory for ex situ analysis. Some disciplines almost exclusively deal with geospatially gridded data or vector data. And then there are a number of disciplines that are very important to CZOs that look at categorical data, not just biological taxonomies, but also things like soil taxonomy, mineralogy, rock classifications. Those are very important. So how do you deal with such heterogeneity? And essentially, the answer has long been, well, you use the least common denominator. So the Dublin core is a metadata standard that's very basic. This is essentially the information that it contains. There's geospatial information here in coverage, and this is a metadata profile for GIS systems, essentially, to tag, what is in the data set, and it's a very basic exchange. The ecological community said, well, at least this is a start. So the LTRs have kind of taken on the ecoinformatics approach, but they realized that they needed to add a few additional bits of information, which actually really do help in their case. But fundamentally, what they're doing is that they're just tagging the data set at the very high level, but they're not going into individual data values, which is that granular, that provides granular search capabilities and integration capabilities that make quasi-HIS or PetDB at AIDA so incredibly powerful. So the answer that our team, we've been thinking about this for a couple of years now, and the answer that we came up with a year and a half ago was that, or more, or actually longer ago than that, but we put in a proposal a year and a half ago. It got funded a year ago. Well, actually, slide that back a little bit. About 2 years ago, we proposed it, and it got funded a year and a half ago now. So was to create a data model that could really have a common core that would work for most data types in most disciplines. And this was a collaboration between AIDA, EarthChem, and the CZO, Quasi, and the CZOData team. We decided to call it Observations Data Model version 2, but not because it was going to be really an obvious next step for Quasi. It was really going to take a much bigger leap than that and try to work across the board, not only for data that's stored in Quasi, but EarthChem, CZOData, and even data from the Integrated Ocean Observing System that NOAA is funding, so even oceanographic data. So again, a common core with optional extensions that can serve the needs of specific communities, but done in a general enough way that that information or that those constructs could be used over and over again. So, you know, I guess we showed this before. We wanted ODM2 to really work for all components. It turned out that Quasi's information system wasn't quite perfect. So ODM 1.1 didn't really work perfectly well for the cataloging functions, and so it had to be modified. It didn't really work all that well for HydroDesktop. So HydroDesktop made modifications, and every time you have changes or differences in information models, there's loss through these transfer. So we had some additional goals that were very important to ODM2. The first one was that it was going to be driven by our community and our use cases. To date, we've had 3 workshops. We have looked carefully at over a dozen different data and information models, and we've received numerous, quite a bit of feedback. The Quasi team has been receiving feedback from day one on ODM1. They've had a number of releases since then, but there are some changes they couldn't exactly make without radical alteration of everything. So ODM 1.1.1 has been stable for quite a while, not because it's perfect, but because it works and there's a whole ecosystem that it works with. The same thing goes for AIDA's data system. They were designed over a decade ago, actually more like 12 or 15 years ago, and they are showing their age. There's a number of uses that AIDA's data systems cannot support. So we decided to really pull all of that together. Oh, and then also there have been numerous groups who've taken ODM1, for example, and modified it, not just in a small way, but in a pretty radical way, or in different important ways to meet their needs. And so we had a whole workshop where we were primarily inviting people who had modified either ODM1 or, in some cases, EarthChem databases to meet their needs. So the use cases were CZOData, Little Bear River, which is a project that Jeff Horsburgh is running mostly with an ODM1 hydro system, but they have needs to manage sensors and deal with water quality data sets that couldn't be fully met. PetDB is the core of AIDA's cyber infrastructure, and I mentioned IUS as another use case, an oceanographic use case. We wanted to make sure that we could make the data model general enough so that it could meet all these needs, but also understandable enough so that we wouldn't have programmers and data managers and scientists scratching their heads every time they looked at it and said, what the heck is that for? So we've taken a lot of care in the terminology that we've used and using repeatable patterns. we realized that we weren't going to have all the answers. So we've made really strong capabilities for ODM2 to utilize external identifiers. I think we've mentioned in the last couple of cyber seminars that the CZO shared vocabulary was going to get a significant overhaul because we want, and CZO display files, we're also going to get a significant overhaul because we want to have the capabilities of the CZO data system to utilize the vocabularies that have already been established and well used by other domains. So we need these external identifiers, vocabularies, taxonomies that have been used by others and are being maintained by others. We wanted to be able to support really rich metadata about specimens, the hierarchy and relationships between specimens, fractions, subsamples, core intervals, all of that. Their relationships to sites and other sampling features, which is a much more generic concept that goes beyond sites, that includes things like trajectories, right? So you can have sensors that move. That includes things like a depth profile, which is not the same thing as a site. So there are a number of other sampling features that we will support. We wanted to have granularity of methods. EPA and USGS ages ago, when they established their approaches, had really high-level methods that concatenated information about sampling procedures, about preparation procedures for specimens, about high-level analytical procedures and relatively low-level instrument methods. And we want to be able to support both that historical use case, but also the ability to separate those all out. We obviously want to keep track of data quality. And as I mentioned earlier, there are now numerous use cases where keeping track of equipment, such as sensor serial numbers that are deployed out in the field and all of their calibration history and maintenance history, is increasingly important for our community. We also, given the trends that Kirsten Leonard described last week, want to support very well data set publishing and archiving capabilities. So we want to take results and package them up into data sets. We want to have the capabilities to version those data sets so we can take a snapshot that can be used and called up in the future to enable reproducible science. We want to have citations and other attributions for data because they're becoming as important for data sets as they are for publications. And we want to understand the full provenance. Where did data sets come from? How were they derived? We want strong annotations and lastly, general extensibility. So those are quite a pile of goals, and it may seem like it's an impossible thing to achieve. I'm going to show a few of these entity relationship diagrams, and I'm going to add a few caveats before we get started here. First of all, ODM2 is very close to completion, but it's not final. There are a few changes. So anyways, just throwing that caveat out there. There are a few things that we're revising, but a lot of it is quite solid. Secondly, I don't think this is the appropriate venue to really get into details about whether, why a certain field belongs here versus there. We have created a GitHub site where we're actively developing very detailed documentation about each of these tables, each of these fields. And if you're interested after this talk, go check that out. We will almost certainly have a much more detailed discussion down the road about ODM2, but today's not the day for that. And so I guess those are the main caveats. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Jeff, before we go through these. I guess before you add one more any additional caveats, I'd say we're going to go through some diagrams, and I'm going to just point out a couple really high-level features that are enabled by what we have done. Anything, Jeff? Are you good?
No, I think you're on a roll, but you might want to just pause for just a second and make sure nobody has any questions before you move on.
That sounds good. How are we doing? Anybody have any questions? Are we doing well? I've kind of started out at a really basic level. I apologize for those who felt like that might have been a review, but I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and understanding. So any questions? Folks can type them in to the chat box, privately to me or Jeff, to the whole group. Speak up, unmute yourself before you start talking. All right. Feel free to interrupt at any time. So one thing so what I'm showing right now is the ODM2 core. These are the tables or entities that we feel are required in every single use case, right? I discussed that idea later on or earlier. It doesn't mean that every field in these tables are required to be filled out every time, but they're at least required to be present so that they can be filled out. So in these diagrams, the N means that things are nullable or optional. One thing that you'll notice is that ODM2, I'll give you a preview, is more complex than ODM1 and probably even more complex than PetDB. But we've been trying to keep it simple. The core is actually less complex than either of those, and that's something that I think we're proud of. I'm going to zoom in a bit so we can see what's at the core of the core, and that is a concept called observation. You'd think that that would be at the core of the core because it is, but of course, the observations data model. Well, we wanted it to be at the core of the core not just because of that nice name that Jeff came up with and his colleagues or whoever they were, but because there's actually governing bodies that oversee information models. And one of the governing bodies that has really emerged as being important for the Earth and Environmental Sciences is the Open Geospatial Consortium, or OGC. And one of their information models that they have promoted and has become an international standard is called Observations and Measurements, or OGC-ONM. And observations and measurements is relatively abstract and relatively high level, but very powerful. So we have designed ODM2 to be a profile of OGC-ONM, which means that other software that's designed around OGC-ONM, we should not have too much trouble in developing bridges or ways in which to communicate that with other software that's developed around OGC and ONM, or other data systems or other data stores. So there are an enormous number of advantages there. So at the core is this concept of observation. And observation in OGC-ONM is defined something along the lines of the act of observing a property on a sampling feature, like a site or a specimen, in order to produce a result or a data value, in order to make a measurement. So there's a verb there, and it brings in the concept of a specific event or an action in which a person applies a method on a given date and time to something that's interesting, like a specimen or a site, and creates a result. Whoops, let me back up. So that concept, we split up in a way that makes it a little bit more powerful. And the folks at OGC are kind of interested in what we've done. We've actually split up action from result so that they're now in separate entities. And what that enables us to do is a couple things. It enables, unlike other implementations or profiles of observations and measurements, it enables us to have actions that are not just results, that don't just produce results. So for example, you could have a calibration action. Well, that one could produce results. That was that example. You could have some generic maintenance action on a sensor or a piece of equipment. You can have an action to collect the specimen. You can have a really high level actions along the lines of a field visit or a expedition or a oceanographic cruise. So actions is where people and organizations apply a method on a given date time. Some of those actions produce results, others don't. So as I mentioned, this is really the only place where people come in, or nearly the only place, and nearly the only place where methods come into the picture. We have developed a relatively robust and flexible way to get people and organizations connected in a many-to-many relationship via this idea of affiliation. So basically, one person can belong to more than one organization, and one organization can have many people, and one action can be conducted by either an organization or a person or both or many, and all of that information can be stored there. So one of the other key concepts that we took from observations and measurements was the general concept of sampling feature. And a sampling feature is very specifically where one collects data or something from the geo environment on which one collects data. So the word sample is used there from kind of a statistical point of view, right? So you are sampling a population in order to collect information. An audio engineer is sampling the sound wave at 44 kilohertz in order to convert that into an MP3 file or something along those lines. So it doesn't require pulling anything out of the environment. It doesn't require. We often use the word sample to describe this idea of pulling something out of the environment, such as a rock or a bottle of water. That's not what's being discussed here. So a sampling feature is just something in which you collect data. There are multiple different types of sampling features, and we have added this class object concept very explicitly here by saying that a sampling feature can have many types, and two types that are quite important and have additional information that's required for them are specimens and sites. And specimens is the term that's been used by Open Geospatial Consortium to be very specific about ex situ sampling features, things that you take out of the environment that you bring into the lab. So we would often call these samples, but here I'm now training myself to use the word specimen, and it is more specific, right? Specimens get archived in museums, they get thrown in the freezer, etc. A site is a location, a point on Earth with a latitude and longitude that you go to repeatedly to collect data. But sampling features can include all sorts of things. It can include a transect, a cruise track. It could include a field area that you, some area that you go to, well, like the Shale Hills CZO, that little tiny watershed, that watershed, the entire thing could be a sampling feature. And that information about where that sampling feature is on the Earth, it can be stored in a single place called feature geometry, which is a special data type that almost all almost, but not all, database systems can handle, and it's kind of it has the equivalent information of a KML file or a shape file. It has vectors and polygons and points can all be embedded inside of feature geometry. All right. So that's what sampling features are. It's kind of it takes a little while to wrap your head around. OGC has tons of different types of sampling features. Anything from well, things that we would use like a well, a soil pit could be a sampling feature, but they have things like mines. I can't remember some of the other weird ones that they have. Another core concept from observations and measurements is the idea that sampling features can be related to each other. And there are all sorts of ways in which you can relate them. So this table right here, this entity, describes those relationships. So you can have a specimen that is a sampling feature that is the child of or of the site. So it basically sits under the site in its hierarchy and would therefore have the same latitude and longitude of the site. And so the specimen's information about where it's located on the Earth is actually embedded in the site, which is the parent sampling feature. So you can create those relationships. You can create sub-samples, right? So you can have a specimen that is the child of another specimen, where that relationship type might just be a homogeneous subsample, or it could be size fraction. So that could have information about the size of the sieve that you use to separate out the sand from the silt or something along those lines. So there's quite a bit of power here. One sampling feature can be offset from another sampling feature, so they might not be exactly at the same location. So again, the specimen might not be collected right at that fence post that you use as your benchmark for your site, but it might be 3 meters down the hill at a bearing of 32 degrees from magnetic north. So to keep track of that information, the relationship says that the specimen is part of the site, but it has a spatial offset from the site that can be recorded in the spatial offset information. Spatial offsets was a concept that was in ODM1, but not as generically implemented with as many possibilities. So a spatial offset type could include depth. So offset 1 value would be the depth in meters or centimeters. So you could get an idea of how deep you collected that soil sample at the site from. Or it could be something much more complex, like the classic example that's been a pain for the folks at the Southern Sierra CZO has been their instrumented trees, where they have trees that are highly instrumented with in radial pattern around the tree, with sensors that are buried at various depths along this at various distances in various directions away from this tree. They want to call it a single site, but they need to keep track of how far away the sensor is, in what direction, and what tree it's located, or what depth. So the spatial offset might be something along the lines of radial offset, where offset value 1 might be degrees from magnetic north, offset value 2 might be distance from parent, and offset value 3 might be the depth below the soil surface, for example. So another offset that's going to be very important is interval, especially depth interval. So a lot of samples are not specimens, excuse me, I'm reverting to my former ways. A lot of specimens in the soil realm are not collected from a specific discrete depth, not 15 centimeters below the surface, but rather the specimen is collected homogeneously between the depths of 10 centimeters to 15 centimeters or 10 to 20 centimeters. So an interval is required to actually fully specify the depth at which a specimen is located, and that is really important information when you're trying to integrate carbon inventories or other nitrogen inventories in a soil profile. So a spatial offset type would be depth interval, and you'd have the top depth and the bottom depth and its units. Likewise, a specimen could be the child, a depth interval could be the child of a sampling feature which is a core specimen. So specimen type is core, and you pull that core out, it's its own specimen, but it also has its own depth interval, etc. So you can be very, very specific about this. There's really an infinite amount of flexibility. Any questions or thoughts? I spent a lot of time on that because I think this issue of specimens versus site versus even other odd things like transects and depth intervals has been a challenge for the critical zone community, and I think we have done a really elegant solution to it. Okay, I'm not going to spend that kind of detail elsewhere. You might have noticed that in the core of ODM2, there was a results table, but actually there is no result value in this table. So this is kind of that higher level metadata about, for example, the entire time series of stream depth measurements that you're making at a given site. Having this metadata kind of separate from the data value is more efficient in terms of storage, allows for more rapid querying, and it actually better supports cataloging functions that are really quite important to cyber infrastructure. So result values are taken outside of that in a separate table that is long and skinny. And right now we're in the process of working on creating, this is one area that we're still finalizing, creating a schema that allows result values to not just vary with time, so you can have a whole time series here, right? So value, date, time, but also vary along other dimensions, such as having a glider in a lake where the glider is bobbing up and down and following some trajectory while collecting continuous sensor data. We want to be able to support that. OGC's O&M supports that, but they support it in a very complicated way. So we're trying to follow that balance between not being overly complicated but being relatively flexible and general enough to support lots of use cases. Let's see here. I don't know if there's much else to say about that. Don't look too closely at that because it's not final. I'm going to fly through the next set of schemas because I really just want to make some high-level points about it. As I mentioned earlier, we want to support external identifiers. So in tables such as methods or variables, there's not a whole lot of constraint on what variable code you might use in your data in your local instance of ODM2. And not that necessarily you all have your own local instance of ODM2, but whoever utilizes this, and I'm going to describe some of the candidates very soon because there are really quite a number of them, and especially important ones, could choose their own variable control vocabulary. But what is important is that that control vocabulary, for it to work in any interoperable way, has to basically connect to an external identifier system, and each record here has the verifiable code and a URI or universal record indicator. Is that right? That's what URI stands for. Which is basically a little bit more generic way of saying a URL that can be fully resolved if possible. A lot of systems are going toward computer to computer communications where codes can be fully resolved on an individual basis. That is, that there's an entire web page, for example, for every single variable and its definition. That's kind of a simplification, but that's kind of the idea. So we want to enable that for all sorts of things, taxonomic classifiers. As you can see here, that these are going off the side. Our capabilities are quite broad, and we've implemented the most important ones. For provenance, which is the information about where something came from, we have also created lots of strong capabilities. At the core of this is citation, and when Kirsten Leonard was talking, she mentioned the need to have strong citation capabilities, and that there was an organization called datacite.org that is kind of overseeing developing strong recommendations, if not international standards, for how data sets get cited. So we're essentially taking their minimum requirements and creating, what's not really shown here, a whole bunch of extensibility to extend this as detailed as you want. But then we're also following the recommendations of how citations get connected to methods, data sets, results down here. It's not fully shown. So essentially, there are relationships between all of these, so that you could say, for example, that this data set is not just a site. So this citation is a citation for a data set, but you can also say that a data set is cited by somebody else. You could say that a data set is a version of a previous data set, etc. So this enables all of those capabilities. Annotations is essentially jotting down notes about any record anywhere in the system. And in many cases, we do have places to put notes, right? I mean, you can have a description of the method, but really that's supposed to describe the method. But let's say you want to say that this action that used that method, that something happened and we modified the method slightly. You don't necessarily modify the whole method, but you just say, well, we did this slightly different thing when we applied that method. So you could have a note attached to that action. And there's one table in the entire database in which all notes are stored. And they can have links to external files, such as photographs. They can, the note can actually be a published note, so you can have it, you can take a note from a citation. You can record, that the annotation might actually link to some type of file, like a calibration file or something along the lines that comes out of an instrument. There's lots of possibilities here, and those get linked to these other tables in this relatively generic way that enables lots of flexibility. So anything really in ODM2 can have annotations, even data values. You could say the data values from this date to this date on this sensor are suspect because we found that a beaver swallowed the sensor and was swimming around with it for a while, or something like that. Yeah, that's a bad example, but you could say, like, basically the sensor got buried in a pile of sediment, and it might be giving you correct data, but watch out. You can add that more verbose information that may be not fully captured in something like a quality code. Equipment we realized that folks in the laboratory and folks who are deploying sensors use equipment, and there's a way to generalize all that information about equipment that can be used for both. We originally started this process thinking that we were going to have a sensor extension and a sample or specimen extension for those really different use cases, but we realized that there were so many commonalities between the use cases when we just took one step backwards that we broke those out into the more logical units, which is, oh, well, people who deploy sensors have to keep track of model numbers and IDs and maybe even maintenance and maybe even calibrations and purchase dates perhaps and other things, and all of that is equally important for the geochemist who has mass spectrometers in their laboratory. So we've enabled the ability to keep track of this information, and the equipment is owned by organizations and is connected to methods, etc. So optional, all of this is optional. You can add it if you want. We realize that results are really often hard to interpret without good data quality information. In some fields, it's an absolute requirement. So there are kind of two levels of data quality. There's kind of general data quality tags that might go onto results, such as, well, what is the precision of this measurement? So the data quality type might be precision 2 sigma or 2 standard deviations or something like that. And then the value would actually be a real value in relative units or absolute units for that particular variable. Or the data quality type might be a quality control flag of some type, and the code might be below detection limit or below reporting level or exceeded calibration range or something like that. There are lots of capabilities. EPA uses all sorts of data quality codes or qualifiers. This supports both flags and values. And external links so that you can have, you can realize where does this come from. Is it something that's used? Actually, that would use the external identifier package. So this would basically link to something like a file or a photograph that might support that data quality information. A lot of data quality information is related to the use of standard reference materials. So there's a need to keep track of those reference materials. The International Atomic Energy Agency produces all sorts of isotope reference materials, which are absolutely fundamentally required to interpret or to even analyze environmental data. So you might actually, when you report a result, the best practice that's really emerging is that you report that result and you say, this is the delta 13 C of some substance normalized to the to Vienna PDB, which is scale, but using USGS 42, which is actually international reference material that is much closer to the matrix that we all care about. It's organic carbon, and unfortunately, USGS 32 has a value that's changed at least 3 times in the literature since it's been produced. So the best practice is to state the value that you used when you did the normalization to that isotope scale. So you have to keep track of all that. So you can keep track of USGS 32 and all that information about it, the lot, etc. You can keep track of the value that you used, and you can then connect it to your results that way. You might, in fact, most labs would analyze USGS 32 or standard reference material as if they were a specimen or alongside other specimens. The reference materials are really no different than a subclass of sampling features, or actually even that are very highly related to specimens, but they're not natural. So those can be actually analyzed using an instrument method and produce a result value that is the result that you'd get as if you analyze it as an unknown. So this supports all sorts of capabilities if you really want to keep track of that information. But the communities, the GeoChemical communities are beginning to see more and more a need to move in this direction. So optional, but it's there if you need it. So when we looked at everything, took that step back, we realized that, gee, the whole lab analysis workflow has been taken care of really quite well by doing a good job of keeping track of equipment, doing a good job of keeping track of reference materials, and other data quality information. There's not a whole lot left. We looked very carefully at laboratory information systems, which are these huge software packages employed primarily by the pharmaceutical industry and the chemical industry to keep track of everything they do. And laboratory information management systems have all of these same features that we're talking about, actions or events. They produce data, of course. They analyze specimens. They had really only 2 additional features that we could see, and one was directive. You know, why are you analyzing something? This might be useful outside of lab analyses. It's just a profile in which it's often quite important. But, you know, this is where you could begin to start describing experimental information, but we haven't really fully explored that. But there's all sorts of things. You could basically say, what project is this under with that, for example. Also, you can add a tiny bit more information to this linking table that links sampling features to results. That makes a lot of lab analyses really quite streamlined, and that is to keep track of the position within a batch of specimens that you're either preparing or analyzing in the whole system. You know, a lot of geochemists do pretty sophisticated preparation steps, and knowing where in the batch you are actually is really important to keeping track of drift and other artifacts that might come about during the sample preparation or the specimen preparation. Similarly, when we look at the sensor workflow, and this is another area that hasn't really been fully explored, we realized that a lot of the needs are already covered by equipment, and by the flexibility of having an action with a method. Let's say we have a deployment action, we basically can preload and say, well, we're deploying the sensor, and it is, we're deploying it in order to collect data on these variables. And for example, there's a little additional information that's quite relevant. And what I didn't show is that there's this related actions table that allows you to keep track of all related actions. I should have thrown that in here. But essentially, with just a little bit extra information, we can do a really good job of keeping track of our sensor use cases. So that is a kind of a high-level summary of the core of ODM2, its extensions that are optional, and what that gains both the data manager and also the downstream software and information models that might use ODM2. It also is kind of the framework for developing controlled vocabularies, which are incredibly important. So I have a couple slides here that just kind of point to some of the use cases, and I know that we're actually have gone up beyond our hour, which I guess now has become a habit of ours. We're going to try and do better at that. So I don't know how much time we want to spend on that, but I've got one slide here, Jeff, for kind of each of our use cases. I don't know if you want to talk about your use case here or not, or if we just fly through this.
I think we should probably have some time for questions and the discussion about, well, why do they care? And I see there's a couple of questions that are popping up in the chat. And the one that just popped up is how do we generate metadata using ODM2? And I think that's kind of a good segue into the why do you care about ODM2 discussion.
Yeah, that sounds like a great thing. So why don't I flip through the last few slides in literally like 60 seconds, and then we'll answer those questions. So I already mentioned that Jeff is now involved in a project that's kind of classic quasi water quality and water resources sensing all around the Little Bear River. He's collecting lots of data, but beginning to see needs that are for managing the enormous number of sensors he has. And Jeff has already created scripts that would translate the data out of his ODM1 database that he's been using into ODM2. And beginning to think about software that will take it to the next, basically enable him to have new capabilities. The Christina River Basin CZO, we have a sediment fingerprinting, a strong interest in sediment fingerprinting, where this really will test the boundaries of ODM2. The current data systems can't handle our need to do sophisticated geochemistry on suspended particles, soils, and compare their composition, and also compare their fluxes with other stream chemistry attributes that are a little bit more common. The real crux of this is that the sample processing scheme that we use is not actually atypical of a geochemistry lab, and we want to keep track of all these various subsamples and all the various data that we get out of this sampling scheme and sample preparation scheme, and bring it all back together and actually relate it to the hydrological data. Another use case is this oceanographic use case. Emilio Mayorga has basically gotten ODM2 to work very nicely for oceanographic, coastal oceanography use cases, in which depth profiles are a fundamentally important sampling feature, and so are cruise tracks. EarthChem has been very interested in developing new capabilities along the lines of volcanic gas emissions, where they're actually getting more and more into the realm of needing sensor time series capabilities and much more complicated connections between specimens and the Earth than what they've had in the past. So there is enough interest in ODM2 that we already have commitments from Quasi's new water data center and to deploy ODM2 to basically make it functional. Quasi HydroShare is quite interested in having ODM2 at the core, or at least as one of the resources that it will use. Jeff could maybe answer more about that. He's part of that project. And we're beginning to get interest from the Data One and Ecoinformatics community, and also from the Open Geospatial Consortium to consider some of the ideas we have in ODM2 for a new profile of their observations and measurements, basically a new data transfer. And then finally, the outcome of the CZ EarthCube workshop was that we submitted a proposal that's now been funded by the Scientific Software Integration Program to develop a web portal client, a downloadable toolbox, and a central software stack all around ODM2. So we have money right now in hand to take all of this to the next level. So that was the end of the talk. You can find out more information about ODM2 at this website right here on GitHub. And maybe we should start answering some of those questions that have been popping up now in the chat window, and anybody else can pipe in too. by unmuting yourself and shouting out. Jeff, you want to take a shot at answering that question about that you highlighted a moment ago about metadata, or why?
Well, I think the two questions that are in the chat right now are related. So the first question is, how do we generate metadata using ODM2? And the second one is, how does ODM2 relate to CZO display files? So one path that I could see in the future is if data managers chose to use ODM2 as an underlying storage structure or infrastructure, then we would consider building tools to actually export CZO display file style metadata from ODM2 into the format that you actually need to post your data using the display files. I think Anthony can probably tell you more about what our plans are coming up with the next versions and next round of CZO display files. But a lot of the work that we've done in defining the information model for ODM2 will actually inform our work with the next round of CZO display files that better support additional data types that go beyond just the hydrologic time series data that you guys have been working with already.
That's right. So Jeff just described a workflow in which maybe in the future one of you has ODM2 toolbox loaded on your own system that you're using for your own data management, and we would develop tools that could create CZO display files. But I think I've been thinking more recently and more intensely about the other direction, which is you all create a CZO display file, and right now the current CZO display file specification is rather limited in what's possible because it has to, the only place it can put the data right now is in an ODM 1.1 database. So it doesn't have the flexibility, for example, to have more than one data quality code attached to a single data value. It doesn't have the flexibility to have three-dimensional spatial offsets between a site and a specimen or a sensor. So we, in CZO display file version 2, we can open up the possibilities because now we know that we have the capability of storing that information. So it allows CZO display file version 2 to be much more flexible, and really we're thinking that CZO display file version 2 could have a soil geochemistry profile that would be slurped into EarthChem just as easily as it would be slurped into any other ODM2 data system. Did that answer the question? Is that? In terms of generating metadata, I think ODM2 will guide what we believe is the minimum amount of metadata. Maybe I'm overstating that a little bit because let's say ODM2 will guide what we could accept as metadata. So it's a guide for kind of the metadata requirement or the profile that is possible to include in a CZO display file or anything else for that matter. Okay, so Luke clarifies and says, how do we generate ODM2 data? Right now, we don't have an easy tool to hand to you. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, we are just finalizing ODM2. We think it is kind of foundational for everything that we're going to do moving forward, but we're just getting started on those next steps because we have just really finalized ODM2. And finalized, I should put in quotes because it's not fully finalized, but most of it is quite stable and is is not going to change. So we're now really beginning to develop the next steps.
But we do actually have projects and funding to develop the next round of tools for ODM2 with the big CZSSI project. So there is a path forward for developing the software tools that are going to be needed.
Exactly. We are in a really fortunate situation that NSF program officers basically said, we trust you, and we're going to give you the funding even before you're done. We're going to give you the funding for the next steps even before you're done. So that means that there will be no gap in activity. We are going to continue full steam ahead. And I hate to actually promise exactly when things will be available, but you know, I think we're going to have some solid products, you know, on the time scale of a year or so, way before your CZOs are nearing the end of their lifespan. We will have products for you. But unfortunately, it's not going to be in the next couple months. The job is bigger than that. So we have a weekly CZOData project team meeting actually on Thursdays at lunch, and we were just talking about that really big challenge is that a lot is happening right now. It's not just because of ODM2 development, but the activity around EarthCube and cyber infrastructure and scientific software in general is really just exploded, and all that activity means that we are in a transition period right now, not just CZOs, but really the whole earth and environmental science community. That transition period is exciting, but it will require some patience because we can't always give you a solid answer. That said, we are going to try and we have already a path in place, which we've described, to move forward with getting data sets registered via the website system that we described last week. And the CZO display file version 1 specification still works, and it will be possible to continue to load data up using that for quite a while. So if you're chomping at the bit to get going, there's all sorts of things that you can do, and we can help you with that. Anything else? Okay. I guess we're wrapping things up. I will say to everyone that we have narrowed down the dates for an IMC meeting. The funding for that meeting, you know, we will have virtual participation, but we will be able to fund 1 data manager and 1 investigator from every CZO to attend. And the 2 dates that we're considering are the last week of May, right after Memorial Day, and 2 weeks earlier. The week just before Memorial Day doesn't work. That week after Memorial Day was not on the doodle poll. I'm going to send out 1 more doodle poll tonight. We're going to finalize that date in the next, I don't know, by Monday morning, and set it up and move forward. And we'll have a good bit of time. Hopefully there'll be a lot more clarity by continuing to do these cyber seminars so that you guys know a little bit more about what we're thinking and what we're working on. And we will use that time to really wrap our heads around actually have you help us develop things like the controlled vocabularies and populate them once we have the structures in place, which are coming along quite well right now, or at least we're making solid, concrete progress on developing systems that can support your contributions. All right. Thank you all. We'll post this recording online. I'll try and do it a little faster this week than I did last week. Thank you all.
Thanks. See ya.